The elevator that skips the 13th floor. The building with no 13th floor. I never believed in urban legends, not until I stepped out of an elevator onto a floor that wasn't supposed to exist. It started when I moved to a new city for work. I found an apartment in a sleek, modern high-rise downtown. The building was perfect, clean, secure, with a stunning rooftop view. But there was something strange about it. Like many buildings, this one didn't have a 13th floor. The elevator buttons went from 12 to 14, skipping the number entirely. I always thought that was just superstition, an old myth that builders followed to make residents feel at ease. But I should have known something was wrong. The late-night elevator ride. One night, I was coming home late. It was around 2 a.m., and I was exhausted. I stepped into the empty elevator, pressed 14, and leaned against the wall, waiting. The ride was smooth until it wasn't. Halfway up, the lights flickered. The elevator jerked violently, like something had grabbed the cables. The air turned cold. And then, the elevator stopped. The doors slid open, but instead of the 14th floor, I was staring at something else, a hallway that shouldn't exist. The 13th floor exists. The hallway was long, dimly lit, and wrong. The wallpaper was old, peeling at the edges. The carpet was stained. The lights buzzed faintly, casting eerie yellow glows. Something about the air felt off, like the whole floor was breathing. I leaned forward, peering out. There were doors lining both sides of the hallway, but no numbers. And then I saw it, a shadow. At the end of the hallway, something moved. Not walking, not running, just shifting slightly like it was waiting, watching. The whispering door. I should have stepped back into the elevator. I should have pressed the close button. But my feet moved forward. I don't know why. It was like something was pulling me in. As I walked down the hall, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. My chest felt heavy, my heart pounding. And then, I heard the whispering. At first, I thought it was the flickering lights. But no, it was coming from behind one of the doors. I turned my head slowly. The door to room 1306. I didn't know why I was so certain that was the number. There were no plaques, no signs. But somehow, I knew, and I knew whoever was whispering wasn't human. The door opened by itself as I reached for the doorknob. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then, the doorknob turned by itself, and the door swung open. Darkness. An empty room. But the second I stepped forward, something rushed past me. A shadowy figure. It brushed against me, ice cold, and disappeared down the hall. The whispers returned, but now they were behind me. The chase, I spun around. The hallway was different now. The walls warped, the lights buzzed erratically. The doors were closer together, suffocatingly narrow. And the shadow, it was coming toward me. Slow, deliberate. I ran. I sprinted back toward the elevator, my breath sharp, heart hammering. The floor felt wrong beneath me, like it was shifting, pulling me back. The elevator was still open. I dove inside and slammed the buttons. The doors wouldn't close. The whispering grew louder. Then, the shadow reached the doorway, and I saw its face, not a face. Just darkness, swirling, shifting. A mouth too wide, eyes like deep, empty sockets. It lunged, back to reality, or not. The doors slammed shut, the elevator dropped, I screamed, and the ding, the door slid open. I was on the 14th floor. Everything was normal. The hallway was bright, clean. The air was fresh. Had I imagined it? Shaking, I stumbled back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep. The final warning. The next morning, I went down to the lobby. I needed answers. I approached the front desk, hesitating. "Hey," I said. "This is going to sound crazy, but last night, the elevator took me to the 13th floor." The receptionist's face went pale. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said quietly. I stared at her. "You knew?" She nodded, glancing around nervously. "The building was built over something, a place that shouldn't exist. The 13th floor comes back sometimes, but it's not always empty." She lowered her voice. "Did you see him?" A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She just shook her head and said, "If the elevator stops there again, don't get out." The disappearing woman at the bus stop, a cold night, and a stranger. I never believed in ghosts. Not until the night I met her. It was late November, and the air had the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. I had just finished working overtime, and the last bus was the only way home. The bus stop was empty, except for one person, a woman, standing near the edge of the sidewalk. She was dressed in a long, pale dress, far too thin for the cold. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders, damp from the misty air. Something about her felt off. I glanced at my phone. 11:57 p.m. Only 3 more minutes until the last bus. She spoke without moving her lips. The woman didn't acknowledge me. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the road. I felt uneasy. After a moment, I cleared my throat. "Are you waiting for the bus?" She didn't answer, but I heard her voice. "Yes." The sound didn't come from her mouth. It was as if the words had slipped into my mind. A shiver crawled up my spine. The bus arrives. The bus pulled up, its headlights slicing through the mist. The doors opened with a hiss. I hesitated. The woman finally moved, stepping onto the bus without a sound. I followed, my unease growing. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, barely looked at her. I paid my fare and took a seat near the middle. The woman sat at the very back. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help myself. She wasn't reflected in the window. A silent passenger. The bus rolled through the empty streets, its engine the only sound in the stillness of the night. I glanced at the driver. He seemed tense, like he knew something. I looked back at the woman. She was staring at me now. Her eyes were too dark, like twin voids swallowing the dim bus light. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You shouldn't have followed me." I turned sharply, but there was no one near me. The voice had come from behind me, but she was still in front of me. The first disappearance. At the next stop, the bus slowed to a halt. An elderly man stepped on. I turned my head for just a second, and when I looked back, the woman was gone. I blinked. Had she gotten off? No, I would have seen her walk past me. She had simply vanished. I turned to the driver, my throat dry. "Did you see that woman leave?" His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't answer. "She's not gone." The bus continued down the dark road, the mist growing thicker outside, and then a chill spread through the air. I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned my head. She was sitting in the seat directly behind me. I didn't hear her move. I didn't see her return, but she was there. Too close. Her face was inches from mine, her black eyes staring into me. I couldn't breathe. "Who are you?" I whispered. A slow smile stretched across her lips. "You already know." The driver's warning. The bus lurched, and I snapped back to reality. The driver was staring at me through the rearview mirror, his expression grim. "You need to get off at the next stop," he said, his voice tight. I swallowed hard. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. He just whispered, "She picks someone new every night." The final stop. The bus screeched to a halt. The driver turned around, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. "Get off. Now." I stumbled out of my seat, my legs shaky. As I passed the back row, I risked one last glance. She was gone. I hurried off the bus, my breath coming fast. The doors shut behind me, and the vehicle pulled away into the mist. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. She still follows me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. For days, I avoided that bus stop. But last night, I heard a whisper outside my window. "You shouldn't have followed me." And when I looked outside, she was standing beneath the streetlight, smiling. The eyes watching me from the forest. The cabin in the woods. It started when I took a trip to the mountains. I wanted solitude. I wanted silence. I wanted to get away from the city, away from the noise, away from the stress. So I rented a small cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect at first. The towering trees surrounded me like sentinels, their dense foliage casting shadows even in daylight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, my books, and the quiet. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I sat by the fireplace reading until exhaustion pulled me into bed. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. Something felt off. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening to the silence, and then I heard it. A whisper. Not the wind, not an animal, a voice, faint, distant, coming from outside. I forced myself to shake it off, probably my imagination. I went back to sleep. The eyes in the trees. The next morning, I went outside to chop some firewood. The cold air nipped at my skin and the ground was still damp from the morning frost. That's when I felt it. Someone was watching me. I turned sharply, scanning the dense tree line. Nothing. The woods stood silent, unmoving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. As I stacked the firewood and turned back toward the cabin, I saw them. Eyes. Deep within the forest. Not glowing, not animalistic. Just dark, human-like eyes peering at me from the shadows between the trees. And then, they disappeared. The scratching at my door. That night, I locked the doors and shut the blinds. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was alone. But as I lay in bed, wrapped in blankets, staring at the wooden ceiling, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic scratching, coming from my front door, like nails dragging along the wood, slow, deliberate. My stomach twisted into a knot. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to move. The scratching stopped. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to relax, bang! A loud, sudden knock shook the door. I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. Silence followed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, let me in. A whisper, just outside my door. I clamped my hand over my mouth. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And the voice? It sounded exactly like mine. The shadows in the forest. I didn't sleep that night. At the first hint of dawn, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my car, I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The trees weren't empty anymore. Figures stood deep within the forest, tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes fixed on me. Hundreds of them. The final message, I sped away from the cabin, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I was miles away, back on the main road. As soon as I had service again, I called the rental company. I needed to know if anyone else had reported strange things happening at the cabin. The woman on the other end hesitated before answering. "Sir? That cabin hasn't been rented in years." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? I booked it online." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "That listing was removed after the last person disappeared." And before I could say anything, the call disconnected.